Okay, as I just said, we're going to be looking at the dynamics of the blockchain. Okay, and again, this is another just introductory lecture, and then we really start the next one. So, how do we build a blockchain? Well, we have miners who mine blocks. The blocks then have the transactions in them. Remember that. That'll be really important in the next topic. But this is about the blocks on the blockchain. The next topic is going to be about the transactions. Okay, so the miners mine blocks and put them on the blockchain, right? As I say, we have this kind of linear model that's happening. And to be the miner that puts the block on the chain, you have to prove your work. You have to prove that you put a lot of work in, and you do that by solving a puzzle. People compete. There's a kind of race to be the first one to solve the puzzle. Remember, the puzzle is you have to find something that hashes to something quite small that involves the transaction, the block, and the nonce. Okay, so the miners compete to be the first to solve a problem, and a miner's probably winning that race is proportional to its hash rate, which is essentially its power, speed. So a miner's probably winning the race is proportional to its speed. The race is not always to the swiftest. It's not like me running against Usain Bolt. It's something different. It's like me fishing with Eve. If Eve's a better fisher than I am, she'll catch fish more often than I will, but if she catches fishes twice as often as I do, then she's twice as likely to catch the next fish at any one time. She's not necessarily going to catch a fish. For me to win a race against Usain Bolt, it would have to be a miracle or something. It's not something that's going to happen 1/3 of the time, that's for sure. Okay, so this is the way that building the blockchain works, right? So the miners with power really have a lot of say of what happens. The miners who have a high hash rate. Okay, remember, it's hard to solve the puzzle. You need to have any chance of solving the puzzle. Really, you need to have serious hardware dedicated to it. Okay, so people now have banks of computers running what are called ASICs, which are application-specific integrated circuits, just to do this. I mean, it used to be, there's a kind of evolution here, because in the early days, anybody could mine blocks within laptop. And then as Bitcoin became more valuable, people put more and more effort into it and more and more hardware. So we went from something you could do on your laptop to something that you needed a good CPU to do. And then at some point, people realized that the best way to do this was not to use a CPU, but to use a graphical programming unit, a GPU. And the same things happened with machine learning. I guess at about the same time. Actually, there's a lot of those GPUs are very, very powerful. So people for a while were using GPUs, and NVIDIA, who makes the best GPUs, shares shot up partially because of the use in Bitcoins. Okay. Anyway, that's an aside. We're not building hardware. So, but now, as I said, so beyond GPUs, we're beyond GPUs. We're in hardware specifically made to solve these problems. Okay, and in fact, some later coins, some old coins, go seriously out of their way to stop having puzzles that can be solved more easily with ASICs because they think it's not very democratic. This is all an aside. So the thing here is we have a hard problem to solve. Whoever solves it first can put a block on the chain. It's not always clear who solves it. Sometimes first, it mostly is, but sometimes there's competing claims, and that's one of the things that happen. So it's not always, as I say, things are not always that simple. Sometimes there's competing claims. Sometimes two blocks get built at once. Sometimes some people try to say something malicious, and the blockchain in itself will, when it grows, will fork and twist in ways we will discuss in this topic. Okay, so, but the real thing is, how do we deal with the uncertainty that develops when we don't have a nice simple chain? Okay, I'm going to recall our first topic many weeks ago. And remember, we read the Bitcoin white paper together. And among the things that seemed odd to us at the time in what was being insisted upon there was all this talk about longest chains. The longest chain not only serves as proof of the sequence of events witnessed, but proof that comes from the largest pool of CPU power. So the CPU, looking for the longest chain is going to give us a sense of the right sequence, but it's also going to give us a sense that the people who are winning the proof of work are the ones that are actually putting things on. Okay, skipping all the rest to the end. Nodes can leave and rejoin the network at will, accepting the longest proof of work chain, the longest chain as proof of what had happened while they were gone. So we're always going to be guided by this idea of the longest chain. So this topic is in a sense all about the longest chain. It's all about, we're going to be guided in everything we do in our response to everything that happens with the blockchain by what is the longest chain. Okay, I just want to finish with the technicality about the longest chain, because it's not clear what the longest chain is, or rather, it might seem clear, but it's actually the wrong answer. So you might think the longest chain is the most blocks, and that's almost always the case, but it's not. It is a reason why we can't leave it at that. Because remember, one of the attacks we were talking about was what I called a fake chain attack. So a malicious actor, Eve is the start of all our problems. A malicious actor, Eve, can make a fake blockchain, right? While you're away, she makes a fake blockchain, and she could do it in such a way that she can game the difficulty algorithm to make it easy for her to make a lot of blocks, okay? And then she's got the longest chain. You come back. Remember, we read the white paper, going back, you go away and coming back. You go away, you come back. The Eve's now got the longest chain in this fake blockchain. So you can get longer chains for not that hard if you can gain the way that the difficulties works. But what you can't do is get more work, because the work is the work. So if you add up the work of the chains, if you make it an easy chain to make, it's not going to be the best, the longest chain in terms of the chain with the most work. So these days, the longest chain means the chain with the most total work, not most blocks. It's just a technicality. I'm not going to dwell on this. I don't think it's going to come up in any serious way in any of the examples we look at. But if it does, I'll let you know. I don't think so, though. So that's where we're going to get to, and we're going to now look at what happens when the chain develops. So I think the first thing is called a reorg, for reorganization. So we'll get to that in just a minute. Right, just to recap, we're going to learn about how the blockchain grows and changes. Some changes are accidental, some intentional but benign, some malicious. Our behavior is always determined by the longest chain. Just a recap of what I just said. We'll learn about how the blockchain grows, whether it changes maliciously or by accident or by design. Our behavior in all these changes is always determined by the longest chain. So I will see you in the next topic, which is the first thing that happens that's unexpected, and that's called the reorg. Hi, we're now ready to look at some details, and we're going to look at first at what's called a reorg, which is the sort of simplest thing, and then we're going to look at forks. But so let's first look at a reorg, and a reorg stands for reorganization. Okay, here's a reorg. Well, here's what we were thinking of as an orderly linear chain. That's very nice. We know where B4 will go, etc., 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 right? Well, it doesn't always work like this. Sometimes something disorderly happens. So B4, which you'd expect to go in B3, doesn't go in B3, it goes on B1. Now, there are reasons for this, and some of them are accidental, some of them malicious, and some of them are on purpose. And we'll learn about the on purpose ones later. Those are called forks. This in this topic. This is what the next two lectures are after this one. So, this is happening here, and from what it looks like, it would just die away because the longest chain goes up to B3, to B2, B3, not B4, and this would be just die and so on. But it doesn't always. And from how can this happen by accident? Well, blocks can come out too quickly and really at the same time and not notice what's happening, or there might be network access issues where because these blocks are mined, but they don't get onto the network because the connection goes down. None of these things happen that often anymore because Bitcoin miners are very serious, well-connected things. And this Bitcoin the Bitcoin mining rate is quite slow. So these don't happen that much in Bitcoin, they happen more in other currencies. So Ethereum, for example, averages a block a minute, and reorgs that involve just one extra block that gets lopped off are very common in Ethereum. And some other coins are faster than Ethereum, so it could happen quite a lot. So it could be malicious, and that's really an interesting thing. So suppose Eve, that Eve comes along and says, I don't want that transaction where I gave Alice 10 bitcoins. I don't want that to be there anymore, so I want those bitcoins back. So I'm going to just rewrite history by having a block come off before the block that had that in it. And I'm going to make this big enough that it's strong, powerful enough so that everybody will use my block, my chain. And remember, this is what I was talking about with fake chains. She might be able to do this if it's just making the longest chain, but making longest proof of work is harder. Okay, so what happens in any case? Usually nobody will build on B4, as I think I've said, and it would die away. But suppose for some reason people do, and it becomes the longest chain, which it can do. So here, in this case, B4, the red here, it represents the dying. Here, B5 and B6 gets put on before B4 dies, and then this becomes the longest chain. And then B2 and B3, which people thought were okay, well, they were okay, but they're no longer okay. And that's what's called a reorg. A reorg is when blocks and transactions that used to be accepted no longer are. This doesn't happen much, but it can be a real danger, especially if you have a malicious actor, a group of malicious actors that control more than 50% of the network, which isn't true in blockchain, obviously. But what does happen when this happens is you get the things that used to be okay but no longer are back on the chain as soon as you can. And usually if it's just an accident, if it's malicious, then they might be very different. But if it's just an accident, they probably going to be more or less the same transactions anyway, because remember, it's almost people are incentivized by the fees, so it's almost deterministic which transactions will get into the next block. So probably they put the same transactions in anyway, so probably not that much of an issue. But it has to be dealt with. But what we're going to look at for the next actually 3 lectures, I think, is what's called forks. And that's where this sort of thing happens, where it changes the shape of the blockchain, but it does it on purpose. And we'll look into that. And there's what's called a soft fork and a hard fork. But I think the way the lectures go from here is the next lecture we talk about forking in general and soft and hard forks, and then we have an example of a hard fork and an example of a soft fork. And that's the end of the topic, I think. Okay, so see you at the forking lecture. Okay, now we're going to talk about forks. Forks are ways of deliberately changing the chain, and the real thing that happens is you change the rule by which blocks can be put on the chain. And there's two different ways of doing that, and one of them is called a hard fork and one's called a soft fork. And the hard fork is when there's essentially a disagreement and the chain runs in two different ways, and the soft fork is when you've convinced enough people that you were right and everybody will change eventually. So people, anyway, we'll get up to that as we go. Here's forks. Nice, simple, very nice, simple, one word title. Okay, so we're talking about making permanent changes to the chain. Forks are a way of doing this. Hard forks break the currency, well, it breaks the chain into two competing bits. Now, two competing lines, and if we're talking about currencies, you get two separate currencies. And we will do an example later in this topic. We're going to do the example of Bitcoin Cash. Soft forks are different. Soft forks change the currency, but they keep the same. It keeps the same currency, the one currency, and it just changes the rules. It's a change of rules without actually changing the current currency. Okay, so this is a hard fork. This is what it looks like. After this happens, the bottom chain is now a new currency, and the two currencies share a common history up to B1. So if you look at the history of the blocks of both currencies, you'll find that they're identical up to B1. And we're going to go through an historic example of this in the next lecture, and then I'm going to, at the end of this topic, I'm going to kind of draw dynamic pictures to get a better sense of how these reorgs and forks affect the network. This is a soft fork. It doesn't sort of change direction, but it's trying to keep the same block, single block currency. It doesn't happen quite as simply as this, and again, we'll see this when we get to the next when I draw the pictures. But we'll still only have one currency or whatever the blockchain is for, but it will operate with different rules. And we'll see an example of this, a couple of examples of this, one contrived and one real. Okay, so here's a sort of summary of hard versus soft forks. They both change the rules of the network. That's where they agree. Okay, the soft fork wants to be something that everybody agrees with. So it'll be relatively low impact. It's trying to create a consensus, or enough of a consensus to carry the chain with it. A hard fork is not looking for consensus. It's looking for, it might have started looking for consensus, but it's not necessarily going to get consensus, and instead it's ready to compete. Okay, so it's ready to compete with the soft fork, but not everything. We'll get up to I'm getting two blocks ahead of myself. Okay, they both involve new softwares and new rules for adding blocks. Now, here's a very big difference with the soft fork. The new rules must be stricter than the old ones. And the reason why is that the old miners, it's an interesting image, the old nodes, the nodes using the old rules must still accept the new blocks. Now that's not necessarily something we need in a hard fork because we're going to start a new currency. But with a soft fork, if we don't want to start a new currency, we need to have the old rules still apply. The old rules have to be looser than the new rules. The new rules can be, so say for example, and this isn't really an example, but if you, well, it's almost. So if you just say, if the old rules will only accept a block if the person who's sending it has a name that's at least 12 characters long, if the new one says it has to have a name that's at least 14 characters long, that's okay, because everybody who's got a name that's 12 characters long has a name that's, everybody who's got a name that's 14 characters long would always be accepted by the one that says it has to be at least 12, right? So the new rule, everything that is accepted by the new rule was already accepted by the old rule. If the new rule said it had to be only 8 characters long, then you'd have some people with names that were 8 or 9 characters long who were making blocks that wouldn't be accepted by people using the old rules. Okay, we'll actually see an example that's almost this when we go on. But that's important. So that's the difference between the soft and the hard fork. I don't care with a hard fork because it's a whole new currency. But with the soft fork, I want it to be the old currency. So I want just a change of the old currency. So I want the old block rules to still be strong enough to get my new blocks in there. Okay. So again, soft you need a consensus. That just means that most of the power has to agree. It doesn't be everybody. Then you can coerce the rest of everybody. But most of where the power is in the minors is what you want to agree. That will guarantee, and I will talk about that when I draw the pictures, but the point is that having the majority hash rate will guarantee that anybody trying to do anything different will never be able to, or at least they might for a little bit be able to make the be longest chain, but they'll die out eventually. Okay? Because once you get the majority hash rate doesn't always win, but it wins most of the time. Right? So they would overrun the soft train if it tried to do it without having majority hash rate. Okay? So the majority hash rate needs to agree. The hard one, nobody has to agree, except if nobody agrees with the new rules, it will die. But you can have half doing one, half doing another, 1/3 doing one, 1/4 doing another, 1/2 doing one, 2/3 doing the other, 1/4 doing whatever. But you can have factions who will then disagree and what the real coin should be. Okay. And then you end up with a new currency. And if everybody agrees, you can replace the old, but quite frequently they don't. And it's one of the ways you have that the number of coins grows. Okay. So that's the difference between a soft and a hard one. We will, as I say, I will draw pictures after we do a couple of examples, because I can draw the example, it will be easier to understand answer the examples, I think. So I'm going to do an example of a hard fork, a real one, and then we're going to do a soft fork, which is a contrived example, and then I'll tell you about a real example. And then I'm going to draw these pictures of the dynamics of this using a screen, which instead of slides, and I think that will make it clearer. I hope so. It would be clearer for me if I were you. Okay, so thanks for this. I'll see you at the hard forks. example of a hard fork. So the hard fork that started the currency called Bitcoin Cash. Bitcoin Cash is called Bitcoin Cash because it was trying to solve some of the problems that stopped Bitcoin from being a currency, a means of exchange. And that's what we're going to be talking about. Topic 8 is all about that. So we'll come back to that, and Bitcoin Cash will should be mentioned at least in passing then. But it's a good example of a hard fork. It's very simple, easily understood example of a hard fork. So let's go. Bitcoin Cash, a hard fork. So Bitcoin Cash is a hard fork from Bitcoin. Okay, so at some point, Bitcoin Cash takes a different route from the rest of Bitcoin. Right. So the background is an argument in the Bitcoin community, which is around about this question of how we can get this to be a means of exchange, using Bitcoin actually as a means of exchange. And at least some people are worried that the transaction rate is just too slow, right? Okay, there's only so few transactions can be done. So they want to increase the block size from 1 to 8 megabytes. So it still would be it would still be a minor block every 8 minutes or 10 minutes, but it would now have much more stuff in it. So we get the same amount of we get a lot more transactions in our block, so more bang for the block. The downside of doing this is it makes it costlier to run a node, and that is one of the founding principles of Bitcoin, that running a node should be cheap enough for anybody to do. So this is how it works. So this faction, this new cult, as it were, writes code that more or less copies was the Bitcoin code, except it makes 2 changes. It says, as of a particular time, and I don't remember what time that is, on the 1st of August 2017, blocks can now be up to 8 megabytes. Now, up until then, and still in Bitcoin, blocks can only be up to 1 megabyte. So this is a big change. It's 8 times as big a possible block. And the second condition it's making here is that the first block after that time on the 1st of August, the first block has to be greater than 1 megabyte. So blocks don't necessarily have to be greater than 1 megabyte, and maybe lots of them won't be. But the first one after the 1st of August has to be greater than 8 megabytes. And the point of that is, it's otherwise we end up, if we accepting everything, and we won't get a largest chain. That's the longest chain to be what we want it to be. We'll see that later on. But that's the vague idea, okay? Now note that the condition is not stricter. In fact, it's looser. It's looser to be up to 8 megabytes than it is to be up to 1 megabyte. Okay, so it's a looser condition. So this couldn't be a soft fork. There's no way you could do this with a soft fork. Even if everybody wanted to do it, it would be something different, okay? So what happened on the 1st of August 2017? Whatever that time stamp was on the 1st of August, the last block mined before it was height 578558. Remember, the height of a block is how many blocks there are before it. So there were 478,557 blocks on the chain when that one was mined. That one was mined, and at that point, after that, some people are trying to mine a Bitcoin block, which would be 1 megabyte or less, and some are trying to mine a block at greater than 1 megabyte. These write meg, you write MB, don't you? But you say meg, so I guess I was sort of speaking as I was writing. Anyway, but you get the idea. These are meg stands for megabyte. Okay. So then what happens after that? So we're 478558, and people are trying to mine the Bitcoin. These different factions are trying to do different things, and not surprisingly, because there's a lot more power who's trying to stay with Bitcoin than trying to enter Bitcoin Cash, the next several blocks are all less than 1 megabyte. They're all Bitcoin blocks. Now, everybody who wants to be on Bitcoin, everybody with the old software accepts these. These are just Bitcoin blocks. But people with the new software do not accept them, because the rule they've got says don't accept anything less than 1 megabyte after the activation until you've already accepted something that's greater than 1 megabyte, right? The rule says the first thing you accept after activation time has to be greater than 1 megabyte, so they ignore all of these. Eventually, a block is mined that's too big for the Bitcoin chain. So what do you do with that block? You don't put it at the end of the chain that's developed since activation time. You go back to you make it a child of the block. You make it a child of the last block before the activation time. Remember, in the puzzle, and actually in the block you made contains a hash of the block before it, right? So which block you're building on top of it is part of the data of the block itself. So this new big block is built on the last block before activation. Okay. These modified new nodes, this new faction accepts the big one. The Bitcoin nodes do not. It doesn't meet the rules. Okay? This makes a new branch of the chain. It's called Bitcoin Cash. And each group thinks of one of the chains as invalid. So if you're a Bitcoin Cash person, the next one the next block you're trying to mine is going to sit on top of that big Bitcoin Cash block, not the Bitcoin block. Each group thinks of the other chain, the other branch of the chain is invalid, but they've got a shared history up to 478558. If you look at the Bitcoin, the block explorer for each of them, you'll find they're identical up to 478558, and from there on they're different. Okay, I just want to say one more thing about this, because I did mention it in passing in a couple of topics ago. Replay attacks. Replay attacks is when the same transaction is broadcast twice. Okay. Well, I wrote about this, about one of the reasons why you might be interested in the Bitcoin transaction model instead of the Ethereum account model, because it's easy to deal with replay attacks. Okay, so replay attack is when the same transaction is broadcast more than once. Having separate chains raises this as a real possibility because people aren't looking. Okay, so each chain only accepts transactions in its chain. So it's careful that way to avoid replay attacks. We'll see. This will be more understandable, I hope. If it's not understandable, I'm hoping it's understandable now. But in case it's not, we will be looking at this in terms of drawing pictures that I think will make it easier. Bye for now. Okay, gang, we're getting there. We've done a hard fork, Bitcoin Cash, it's a real one. We're now going to do a soft fork. not a real one, and then I'm going to talk about a really actually important soft fork. Okay, but it's harder to understand, so we're going to run through the fake one, and then it's all going to become crystal clear to us all, because I'm now then going to go and draw pictures on the board, and I love doing that. So if it were up to me, we'd have those slides. I'd always be doing that, but I know not everybody likes that, especially maths people tend to like it. Computer scientists not. So, but for this particular case, it's really, really useful. So we'll do that as soon as I finish this. And this is a short lecture, and then that'll be another short lecture, and then we'll be done with the topic. And we'll be ready for the next topic, which is really exciting, and it's about how to change what transactions are in a way that will make it possible to make currency, make Bitcoin a real currency. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's get back to this. Soft forks. We're on soft forks. Okay, ready? Let's go. Soft forks. Yep, told you. Okay, so here's my new coin. I'm calling it Bitcoin Stingy. Okay, it's not a real coin, but what's different about it is it's going to only have smaller blocks. Remember, what we did with Bitcoin Cash is we got big blocks. Now we're getting only smaller blocks. Instead of having any blocks up to 1 megabyte, we're going to have blocks up to 1/2 megabyte. Okay. Well, that would make it easier to run nodes, I guess. So somebody might suggest such a thing. Now this is really important. So the next bit is that it's easier. It's stricter to be within 1/2 megabyte than it is to be within 1 whole megabyte. It's a stricter statement to say you're smaller than 1/2 megabyte than to say you're smaller than a whole megabyte. Got that, right? Stricter statement. It's a strictly harder thing to achieve, to be within 1/2 than to be within a whole. And then everybody who achieves being within 1/2 megabyte is within a whole megabyte. So that's what it means when I say it's a stricter requirement. So we can do that for a soft fork. And the point for that, remember, is that anybody who just who's got the old rule set will accept all the things that are being mined. They don't have to change their software to be able to accept all the things that are being mined. They would accept other things, but they're not going to be mined in the end, and we'll see how that happens. That's the kind of thing we're going to do when we see pictures and make it all crystal clear, and it's all to do with longest chains, as I promised. Okay, so the original nodes would accept these blocks, while they would not accept the 8 megabyte block. So the Bitcoin Cash thing doesn't work that way. You have to change your software if you want to be a Bitcoin Cash guy. Okay. So how the soft fork works? Well, for it to work, we need a majority of the hash rate, the mining power, to be on side. So say we have 70% or something want to do this. You don't need everybody to want to do it. You just need more than half. It might take a while to actually work if it's only 51%. So let's say it's something like 71%. And the reason that it will work with any amount of the power being more than 50% goes back to what we've said several times about the mining gets done by percentage-wise. If you own 20% of the power, you'd expect to do 20% of the mining, etc. So if 70% of the mining is in favor of this, 70% of the miners are in favor of this. Not the miners, but the mining power. 70% of the mining power is behind this, then 70% of what gets mined will be behind this. And that will make the other things disappear because of the longest chain idea. Okay. Now, I don't expect you necessarily to follow what I just said, but you can come back and think about that after we see the pictures. The pictures will make this clearer than I possibly can do with words. Okay, so, but just to say that if we need to have a majority of the mining power on our side here. Okay, so suppose we have a majority of the manpower on our side. It doesn't matter about what the nodes want. They're kind of, here democracy goes out the window. We don't really care. It only matters what gets put on the blockchain, and what the nodes want is irrelevant except for the mining nodes. Okay, now everybody can accept the new small blocks, but any block bigger than a half meg, I know I'm using the purple MB, I see, any block bigger than a half meg will be rejected by the majority of the mining power. Okay, then so people aren't going to be mining them is really the problem, the thing. The miners will build new things, and they'll put it on the last small block. They're not going to put it on big blocks. They don't accept them. And that's what happens with this longest chain idea, right? Okay? And people accepting everything, people who are still in the old mindset, will experience a reorg, which is why I talked about reorgs at the beginning of this topic. And we'll see all that in the picture will make it clear, okay? And then people, once the reorgs happen, people give up on large blocks altogether. Even the miners, the 30% of the miners who thought they didn't want to go along with the new model. And we end up with a single chain. And so we're still Bitcoin, but we only have small blocks. Okay, so Bitcoin Stingy becomes Bitcoin, but this hasn't happened. I hasten to add, this has not happened. This is just me making this up. Nobody's done this one. However, the one I'm about to show you, which is harder to understand, is really important to the development of Bitcoin, and I can't think off the top of my head when it was brought in, but it will be in notes. So I think, okay, it's called SegWit. So, and there's also something called SegWit too, but we'll stick with SegWit for now. This is a real soft fork, okay? SegWit, and you'll see this, lots of references to this in the Bitcoin literature. SegWit stands for segregated witness. Okay? And the idea is you separate out the signatures, which, remember we talked about this when we were talking about transactions, we use the word witness and signature interchangeably. They're not quite interchangeable, but they're more or less interchangeable, so we'll leave it with that. So you're just separating out that signature part from the rest of the transaction. In fact, puts on a separate Merkle tree. Now, that frees up a lot of space. So this leaves space for more transaction that's on the block, and you actually can do some optimizations with the signatures, which is beyond the scope of what I'm going to do with you. But I might suggest some readings. Okay, this partially solves the same problem as Bitcoin Cash, right? Because you now can, we haven't made the blocks bigger, but we're able to get more transactions in them because the signatures can take up to 2/3 of the transaction space, the space of the blocks. And we can get considerably more transactions on the block this way. Okay. SegWit also makes it harder to alter transactions. I'll give you some readings for that. There's only so much we can do in these lectures, but it's important. It's really important, and SegWit's a really important enabler for everything we're going to do in topic 8, which is what this says here. Okay, as I said, the next topic is going to be around those more flexible ways of doing transactions that are enabled by SegWit. So that's where we're going to get to in the next topic, but we're not quite done with this topic, because in this topic I promised you, and I promised myself, that we're going to draw some pictures. Well, I mean, don't get too excited. This isn't going to be the Mona Lisa. It's going to be just dynamics of the blockchain under all these conditions. So we're going to do that in a minute. So I'm going to go now, come back at my drawing board and do that, finish those pictures, then we'll get on to into the question, the really interesting question about whether Bitcoin can ever really be a serious mode of exchange, medium of exchange. Okay, and the SegWit is part of what makes it possible, but we'll talk about whether it actually happens or not next time. Okay. Here we've got blocks coming along, okay? Right, so what happens with a reorg? Well, we've got the blocks, right, and then somebody comes along and puts a block in the wrong place, for whatever reason, and continues. And for some reason that continues until it becomes the largest block, the largest chain. So what happens when somebody has to put on a new block, a new line comes along, they always go to the longest chain. So as soon as this becomes the longest chain, that keeps going. And once this keeps going, this atrophies. This is no longer in the chain that is kept in the ledger. That's it. So they're gone. So as I said, this is the simplest thing. But let's look at this. We suppose you have transactions in here. Well, you'd hope that the system was able to then put them in someplace else, and that's what happens. And as I said before, if it's an accident, probably the same transactions more or less are already on the line. But, so that's really what happens with reorg. That's easy. So what happens with our hard fork? So what happens with Bitcoin Cash started? Okay, so we're going to have, let's see if we can do I'll have a color code. So these are small. And these are large. Okay, you can see why I don't write generally. Okay, so we're going along, everything's small. Everything's under 1 megabyte. And then suddenly we get this point on August the 1st. I think it was August the 1st. And what happens is, people are still, most of the miners are still Bitcoin miners, so they're just sticking with these green ones until it just happens to be the case that the next thing that gets mined is by one of these people who want to be a new guy, and so he gets a bigger thing here. Now, he builds it on top of there, right? Okay, now, well, at least, yeah, anyway, never mind. He built it on top of there. So what happens next? Well, the Bitcoin people are still building here. So they continue. But then the Bitcoin hash people, what are they going to look at? What's their longest chain? Their longest, even though the longest chain in any place is this green one, the longest chain for the Bitcoin hash people is this one that leads to here. So they're just the next one, whether it's small or large, we'll assume it's large, goes here. And even if it's small ones, I don't know what this is, we would put them here if they were done by the Bitcoin hash community. And that's the point, the Bitcoin hash community and the Bitcoin community diverge completely in what they think of the canonical blocks are. The Bitcoin hash community thinks this whole thing is and the Bitcoin community thinks this one is. So they share the first part of it, but then they disagree. The interesting one's a soft fork. Because I wanted to talk about what happens to the people who don't want to change. So we're going along, then we have this new rule, this new stricter rule, okay? So the new stricter rule, so in this, let's make it a different color, so purple is stricter. So that's all fine and dandy, and we're going along with these new rules, and then something comes along that doesn't meet the new rules, okay? And somebody puts it on the blockchain, yeah? But this is not going to be accepted by everybody. In fact, it's not accepted by, boy, that's awful. Let me just write that again. Okay, this is, how do we make this, that's what we want to do. Okay, so this one is not accepted by most miners. When I say most miners, I mean most mining power, which isn't necessarily the same thing. So what happens? So what happens to the next thing that comes along? So this is too big. So this is not, because it's too big. Remember, this was to be on the chain now. You have to be less than half a meg. Okay, so that's too big. So it's not accepted by the next miner. So the next miner comes along and he says, okay, I'm going to do this. Yeah, and then the next miner is probably also not going to do that, because remember, most miners are not accepting these green ones. So what happens even when the next green one comes along? Where's it going to go? It's going to go here on the longest chain. So what happens to this bit here? We have a reorg. Now this reorg is not going to be experienced as a reorg for the people who aren't accepting this node anyway. But for the old-fashioned people who didn't want to do this fork and just wanted to stick to their old software, they would have accepted this, and now they're going to have to unaccept it. So they've got a reorg, and this isn't going to last very long. People aren't going to hang around for these reorgs. So this is going to all atrophy and die, and then just gets this one chain. So that's the way soft forks work. Okay, I enjoyed that. I hope that picture made things a bit clearer. Okay, so that's it for now.